Dana Crawford is perhaps the best-known preservationist in Colorado, but unless you work in urban planning, real estate development, or architecture, you've probably never heard of her. Hi, I'm John Ferrugia. Since the 1960s, Dana has been saving and creating spaces, from Larimer Square and the Oxford Hotel to the Flour Mill Lofts in Union Station. Lower downtown Denver would not look the same without her tireless efforts. Discover the woman who changed the face of a city. And now, Colorado Experience, Dana Crawford.
Dana Crawford is a force of nature.
She single-handedly had a vision which grew and grew and grew into the city that we have today, which is a world-class city.
When you are walking around Denver and you're thinking, well, this is a nice area. This is really such a vital city. You're unknowingly giving a tribute to Dana Crawford.
She was doing something before there was a National Register of Historic Places.
Dana is incredibly creative, incredibly bright, incredibly visionary, but also battle-hardened. She did tough things at a time that it just wasn't what women did.
Denver would not be what it is today without Dana Crawford.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
Born in the small town of Salina, Kansas during the Great Depression, Dana Crawford did not seem destined to become one of the most prominent preservationists in the country. Dana's intense self-motivation and infectious personality followed her throughout her early years, but she did not start her life's work until she set foot on the streets of lower downtown Denver in the 1960s. From then on, Dana worked tirelessly to preserve and revitalize forgotten areas of Denver, making it the vibrant, rich city that it is today.
For a long time, I said I was a preservationist. Then it seemed to me that preservation became sort of a frightening subject to a lot of people. So then I said that I was a civic entrepreneur. And then I said I was a developer. I'm back to being a preservationist.
She's one of the great preservationists in America.
Historic buildings don't work if they're empty. You can't save a building and not use it.
I think it's impossible to list all of the projects that Dana has done because there are so many.
Larimer Square, it will always be a favorite, and the Oxford Hotel will always be a favorite. The Union Station project is just a big star, a transformative project in a neighborhood that I worked on for over 50 years. I think I was led into it by fate. Once you become involved with development, it definitely takes over in your life. If you do something and people love it, you want to do that more.
Dana Hudkins was born on July 22, 1931. Dana's childhood was a happy one, surrounded by the love of her family and friends.
Dana Crawford in her younger days had opportunities and experiences that might not have added up for anything for another sort of person, but became a vision and an action plan for her.
I was born in Salina, Kansas, which is a community at that time of 32,000 people, plunk right in the middle of the state of Kansas. I was an only child, which was a very big disappointment to me, but I had lots of friends, and Kansas people are very friendly people, and so I had a really fabulous time growing up there. And every summer, my mother and I would go to Ohio to visit her family. That's probably where the interest in old buildings and historic stories start. Salina was such a great place to grow up. I'm sure that this driving force that I have about building community started there. My mother was very interested in the cultural side of life and was very active in the Art Association.
Her father managed a boat dock and marina, and she worked there in the summers. And her father was a distributor of Chris crafts. In the background of our growing up, we heard the whistles of the trains. And we were also aware of the cathedrals of the plains, they're called, the wonderful grain elevators, which were all concrete and always painted white.
She was an outdoorsy young woman, horseback riding and boating, curiosity too. She probably was a lot for a lot of young men her age to handle.
I went to a lot of schools. They were all in historic buildings, and I lived in a big home with a lot of other gals. I had graduated from the University of Kansas with an English Lit degree. What are you going to do with an English Lit degree? Teach or find somebody to marry you, preferably.
Be ambitious as a woman in post-World War II America, kind of a framework where the ambition should be a well-placed husband and very excellent children. It's not great to be a very visible dissenter from that.
I was in a great graduate program that was part of Harvard and Radcliffe. We had a great time there. And of course, being in Boston was an inspiration, a complete inspiration.
And she talks about going to Radcliffe and how sophisticated she thought. First time she was served a martini, she was asked if she wanted an olive or an onion, and she wasn't sure what they meant by the question. Living back east, she was really exposed to an incredibly rich urban environment that influenced her for the rest of her life. Boston is one of the most walkable cities in America. It has all of these beautiful historic buildings that have a very pedestrian orientation.
I've wondered often what Denver would be if Dana Crawford hadn't decided to move from Boston to Denver.
When the time came for me to find a career, I had planned to go back to Boston, but my roommate-to-be got married that summer, so I had no one to live with, and I had friends here in Denver, and by that time I knew I wanted to go into public relations. I had the list of people in the middle 50s that I wanted to interview with and that I wanted to go to work for. And the people that I wanted to go to work for didn't really want to hire me. So I decided that I wouldn't let up. And I like to wear hats. I don't wear hats as much as I did then, but I would go out for every little job interview that I had with Costco and Associates. I would go out and buy a new hat. And then all of a sudden they had to go to a long meeting in Colorado Springs and they didn't have anybody to cover the office. So I got the phone call and got the job. And through the very limited number of people in the PR field, I got to know a lot of people in just a very few weeks. That turned out to be the foundation of friendships and working relationships for many years. And I got to know how to sell an idea.
As Dana thrived in her public relations career, she met and married John Crawford, and together they had 4 sons. She kept several clients and worked out of her home office while caring for her family. She even volunteered full-time at the struggling Denver Art Museum, but she never lost the dream to do something big.
John Crawford was a petroleum engineering graduate from mines. He was a geologist. He did get going in the oil and gas business. 4 tiny children and a very active social life. That would seem to do it for most of us. With John Crawford, she did end up with a person who could say, you seem to be a person who's always going to get in trouble. You might as well get in trouble making money.
After World War II, good times came back to Denver. Denver really began to boom once again in the 1940s and 1950s. The Tabor Block and the Mining Exchange building and so many of these gems of Denver in the 1880s and 1890s were now run down and dilapidated, subject to almost a century's worth of neglect.
There were 2 huge federally funded programs that dramatically played into how American cities look today versus how they looked before World War II. And that was the development of the interstate highway system, which was funded under the Eisenhower administration, and right on the heels of that was the idea of urban renewal.
Funded by the federal government, the Denver Urban Renewal Authority, or DURA, planned to demolish more than 30 square blocks of historic buildings in downtown Denver.
The city's plan was to basically remove this, what they call the blighted community, and replace it with modern new buildings in a post-war architectural style.
Even the citizens of Denver voted to tax themselves to advance this urban renewal program. There really was very little value for the beautiful historic buildings that made up Denver at that time.
And the idea was if you tear it down, they will come. New developers who would come in and rebuild your cities. And in fact, that really did not occur.
The urban renewal was absolutely not unique to Denver. People were coming back from the war, they were having kids, they wanted to move into nice new homes in the suburbs, conspiring to build sort of the future America that we all know now. And it was coming at the cost of demolishing old America.
Denver had lost a lot of buildings. There were a lot of parking lots that surrounded downtown, and on every one of those parking lots had been a historic structure.
But it wasn't until Dana Crawford came along that somebody actually came up with a positive plan to do something about it.
What Dana wanted to do was to create these great people places like she had seen in other cities, in Boston, in her travels in Europe. She was at odds with the city fathers at that time who were very active in this urban renewal program.
My passion was to find an area that I thought would work from an historic building perspective, and also be a place where generations come together and celebrate their city. And I kept looking for the place.
Larimer Street was Denver's original main street. It had been laid out in 1859 by William Larimer.
It's where our first post office was. We had a city hall. It was really one of the first streets in Denver.
But in the 1890s, Denver's business district had reoriented down 16th Street and 17th Street instead. By the 1890s and early 1900s, Larimer Street, once Denver's main street, had kind of fallen onto hard times. It had streetcar lines right down the middle. It had horse poop in the middle of the street. The sky was black with telegraph lines.
The story goes she would get in her car and drive around the city and look for opportunities. One day on a particularly hot day, something happened to her car.
Larimer Square was Skid Row, and here's this well-dressed, East Coast-looking, pearls and a hat, and her car breaks down and there's some drunks in a doorway. And instead of being afraid or whatever, she just asks for their help. And they're all just perfectly pleasant to her, and she's perfectly pleasant to them.
And while all this was going on, she happened to notice the buildings around her, and sure enough, it was Larimer Square. That was in 1964.
All kinds of life experiences come together for her. The memory of New England towns, the sense of community of people bumping into each other in a small town in Kansas, all that comes together for her. And ambition.
I realized that everything that had become the city started in the 1400 block, and that it was slated to be removed. And I distinctly remember thinking, I've talked about this a lot, and now I have to do it. Oops. And that oops was a really long time because I worked on it for 22 years.
She found out who the owners were, what the situations were with tenants or not tenants, and then just quietly made an offer.
She was doing something before there was a National Register of Historic Places, long before there were any sort of tax incentives. She was trying to be a step ahead of Dura to purchase the buildings before they did.
What she did was accumulate an entire block, which created even more value because you really had a place. And in fact, almost a neighborhood, a mixed-use neighborhood.
I mean, the buildings were always beautiful, but they had fallen into huge disrepair. They were filled with pigeons, and one of the buildings actually didn't even have side walls. All of their electricity, their plumbing, everything needed to be rebuilt. This was a huge, huge restoration project.
If you're going to take on a project, as Dana Crawford did, you have to be subtle and maybe even sneaky, because if people know that there is some major economic development plan underway, the prices are going to climb very fast. Then launching a very ambitious enterprise of getting the funding.
She tells the story of going to a bank, describing the vision for a project, and the banker kind of looks at her blankly, and then he turns to Dana's husband and starts asking questions. She was doing business in a time when women just didn't do this.
No banks would lend to her. Who would lend to a mother of 4 kids who just has a dream? So she managed to finance it with friends and her husband.
I didn't feel limited. And that's partly because of the graduate program I went through. I was balancing a family and the job and a lot of volunteer work, just juggling. And then the idea of loaning money to save some of the buildings on Skid Row to some organization that was led by this dame made it really easy for the bankers to say no.
She had that additional obstacle of being a woman in a man's world. And real estate development, you need to have some sharp elbows, and you also have to have good political savvy, and you gotta be a big risk taker. And Dana's got all those things in spades.
A man with force and enterprise is not going to make everyone feel comfortable. A woman with force and persistence is going to leave some people just rattled.
Larimer Square is still successful today.
Larimer Square was the first project, but it was the project that led to many others.
You talk a lot about urban pioneers. Well, Dana's more like an urban guerrilla. I mean, she goes in really early, long before anybody else has even considered developing in a place. And that's hard. That means you're sometimes there by yourself. That was certainly the case with the Oxford Hotel.
The Oxford was built in 1891, continued to operate as a hotel all through World War II. In the late 70s, it was really primarily a flop house. You could rent a mattress for about $10. The neighborhood was really Skid Row. I would say that Lodo was just low. The hotel was up and running, but they were forced to throw the hotel into bankruptcy in 1986. The bankruptcy did not stop Dana. They found a partner, they recapitalized the hotel, worked their way out of Chapter 11. When I met Dana in 1989, the hotel was doing very, very poorly. We conjured up a plan and put the hotel back into Chapter 11, as Dana affectionately called the second one Chapter 22.
In October of 1985, Dana's life changed forever. Her husband and partner, John, suffered a fatal heart attack, and within 2 weeks, she also lost her father. Dana slowly recovered, but she never remarried, instead focusing her efforts on her sons and many grandchildren and her work.
Dana Crawford is smart. She's got amazing intuition. She's funny, she's tough, holds you accountable.
She became a realtor so she could have a license to do these buildings and didn't have to depend on someone else to do it. So she got a London taxi cab to take her clients around to convince her investors that this Larimer Square or Lodo or the Oxford was a great investment.
The flour mill lofts were originally flour mills created by the Longmont Farmers Alliance. Ultimately, it was taken over by the Colorado Milling and Elevator Company, and ultimately flour milling went away from Colorado or consolidated in places like Commerce City. And for decades, it was abandoned, a dilapidated building that was used as a crash place for drug addicts.
In Kansas, your primary landmarks are the grain elevators as they really flow out across the prairie. And when I first moved to Denver in '54, I spied the flour mill. Ultimately, we were able to develop the flour mill and kind of be a pioneer out there in the Platte Valley.
The flour mill is a special project for her because it's sort of a reference to Kansas. It was full of equipment, it was full of graffiti, and some of the graffiti is actually still in the stairwell.
99.9% of the people looked at that building for years and years and years and years. And she saw lofts. Everybody else saw tear the thing down.
By doing the first projects in Lower Downtown, she proved that there was a market, not only for a hotel or a design center, but maybe most important for residential.
Union Station was originally built in 1880. Between the 1880s and the 1940s, Union Station was the hub of downtown Denver. Tens of thousands of people passed through Union Station every single day.
To the end of World War II, train travel was really super important. The advent of suburbs, people wanted to get out of the cities, so Union Station really slowly started to deteriorate. And so Dana and I walked over to Union Station one day. We were standing in the Great Hall. There were no people in there. There were these wood benches, tons of hard surfaces, echo chamber, an empty building. Dana goes, "We're going to turn this into a hotel." I said, "Great, let's do it."
Denver had been working on that project for easily 25 years, and Dana had been probably envisioning the reuse of Union Station for all, if not longer, of those 25 years. This was a long-term vision to really make Union Station become something that was the heart of our city.
Lots of meetings, lots of conversations involving historic Denver and the city and developers and the property owners.
She had a lot to do with the idea of a plaza, the idea of maintaining the open space so that it could really become Denver's most important public space.
It's as close as you can get in Denver to the Piazza Navona in Rome. It is that kind of urban experience. There are kids playing, there are people down there shopping at the market, there are people who've just strolled down. It truly has become Denver's living room. A massive undertaking to shoehorn a hotel into what's actually a very small building. It was just one of those projects that only Dana could have actually pulled off because there were so many different entities. The property was owned by RTD, different investors, History Colorado reviewing it for federal tax credits. The city of Denver was reviewing it for Denver landmark concerns. It had to be organized in a way that we were all moving towards the completion of that project. Dana was the only person that could have really pulled that off.
She's also been called on by cities and developers around the country to help them visualize what's possible.
Because she sees that historic sense of place. And that's what she sees in Idaho Springs. She goes, oh my gosh, I did not know this was such a cool place. It's got great bones, we just need to do something with it.
So she's always, her entire career, taken on projects nobody else would have even considered. So the idea that she's working on Idaho Springs and the Argo Mill, and while it may be a Superfund site, none of that will be an obstacle for Dana.
The Argo Mill and mine are, I guess that it would be the epitome of a preservation challenge and opportunity, because everybody knows that property and they're all curious about the property, and it's such an extremely important part of the history of Colorado and the United States. Superfund sites have been reused all over the country. I guess that I'm just mostly attracted to difficult projects. Hopefully, ultimately, we'll be able to build houses.
Dana always said she wanted to build an Italian hill town, and she says this may be her last chance. She has a vision really of expanding development around the Argo Mill that really will contribute to the economy of Idaho Springs.
The vision for this 27-acre Superfund National Historic Site is this will be a destination and an education center also for students that want to learn about the history of mining and milling in the United States. At one point, this was the center of technology for these processes back in the early 20th century. Dana has even said she thinks this is going to be bigger than Union Station.
I'm currently obsessed and have fallen in love with Trinidad, Colorado. It's a very, very remarkable and sensational community with a gigantic history in the very far southern part of the state of Colorado.
She is very involved in working in the town of Trinidad in southeast Colorado and helping to save historic buildings. She has acquired an old brewery down there, and she's working on turning it into both a brewery and a sort of a boutique hotel. She has been very supportive, along with the city of Trinidad, on developing a project down there that will provide housing for artists, very affordable, and again, I think fundamentally change the economy of Trinidad.
Preservation is important because it gets inside people, and they understand that they are part of a changing tradition for their community. If they understand where the community has been, then they have a much better opportunity to participate in its future.
And everybody thinks of Dana as this incredible preservationist, and she is. But that's almost a byproduct of what she does. What she's really about is using old buildings to create really vibrant, really lively urban spaces, places that become part of our lives. And she is creating these incredible gifts that she's leaving the city of Denver that happen to involve preserving historic buildings.
Historic preservation really is very engaged with the who are we now and who do we want to be in the future.
Walking through Larimer Square, you can feel it. And Union Station, you can feel the bustle of late 1800s and early 1900s of what that train station was like. But now it's an uber living room of Denver, isn't it?
Anyone who accomplishes a great deal is always subject to criticism.
Dana Crawford found out a way to make history pay. However, in so doing, she priced out the historic community that had lived in that neighborhood for more than 80 years.
It's a tough time right now because Denver is such an extraordinarily desirable place that we risk becoming the San Francisco of the Rocky Mountain region. And it is a tough problem I don't know the solution to. She really grew up in an environment where to be successful as a woman, you had to be pretty aggressive. I think men can have the same attitude and can act the same way, but you don't say that about a man.
Fortunately, the critics don't bother me a whole lot. I'm kind of a person that likes to be friendly with everybody, but sometimes I get grumpy and outspoken and subject to deserving to be criticized. I mean, buzz on, you know? If you spend a lot of time worrying about what people say about you, you're going to spend a lot of time that you could spend doing something meaningful.
While much of Denver has become a sprawling metropolis of the future, Dana Crawford made her mark on the city by protecting and enhancing its history and roots. Despite massive structures that have turned Denver's skyline into one of metal and glass, Dana Crawford's efforts have maintained the brick-laced soul of the city for modern times.
And she's not finished. Dana and her ideas are just as important now as they've ever been. She's ageless.
Dana reminds us every day is that if first you don't succeed, try again. And the fact that she is still doing this today just demonstrates the energy that she has, that the vision she continues to have, the ideas she always has, and her ability to pull people, projects, and financing together to get them done.
I don't think there's anything slowing Dana down. She loves it too much. If you're in the real estate business, find out where Dana's going, wait a few years, because she's way ahead of everybody else, and then buy everything in sight, and you will do really, really well.
We're grateful to the work that she's done here. We're grateful for the mentoring she's done, and we're so grateful to her for the buildings that still stand today because of her investment, her ideas, her vision, and her hard work.
And this is a great time for America and for the world. There is a much greater appreciation for the built environment.
Dana's legacy is the city of Denver.
I love you, Dana.